12. It's on.
Well, I want to welcome everybody tonight to this lecture. If I've got this figured right, it's about the 12th one in this series of 18 lectures on the spiritual quest with guidance from Rahner. We've been trying to go through really a progression, a systematic approach to the questions of the spiritual life. If you remember back at the beginning, we began with a lot of the questions about who we are as human beings and so on. And we worked our way through in this quarter on questions of Christ and now on the church. This is the third one in which we're trying to discuss the church in relationship to our own spiritual searches. This is now the end of this winter quarter. You'll notice on the handout I have a reminder for you of when the next series starts, in case we don't know what to do with our Tuesday evenings. April 23rd, we will begin the last set of 6 lectures here in the auditorium. Also, before we get to that point, I want to remind you we have the next of our Murray lectures. Those are named after the great theologian John Courtney Murray, and we have one of those each quarter in Corpus Christi Parish. We've had a lot of famous theologians right here on our campus, people like Michael Novak this last quarter, and Hans Kuhn, who has been here, and so on. Our lecturer for this next quarter is Don Senior, who's a biblical scholar from Chicago, and he will be here April the 14th, lecturing here in this hall on Christ the physician, healer of personal and societal wounds. So I will vouch for him. I've heard him speak, and he is a terrific popularizer of the Scriptures. If you're talking about the miracle stories of Jesus. So I really highly recommend that. You might get that down in your book now. It's April 14th. That's a Sunday evening, and right here in this hall. And he will be understandable. He's a great popularizer. You can feel free to bring your friends and so on. And one of our outstanding biblical scholars, and a terrific guy too, very fine person. For the people who are looking for more reading in the interim, you can keep reading along in your Foundations of Christian Faith. You can cover the material in there. That gives you a comprehensive view of what we've been trying to say in this particular series of lectures. And then I will remind you of one other thing. In that interim, we will be celebrating the first anniversary of Rahner's death on March 30th. So I'm going to talk more about that tonight, a little bit about him. Well, I might as well do it now before I get into. But there is an alarming thing that has happened in the light of some of the other things we've talked about lately. You might have seen in Time magazine an article about a book that Rahner did on the unity of Christianity. He did it with another theologian, and the Time magazine said it was attacked by young theologians. Well, I mean, that's not too unusual in itself, but I just heard today that an attack on Rahner appeared on the front page of Osservatore Romano, the major Vatican newspaper. I don't have a copy of it yet, so I'm not in a position to comment on it. But from my perspective, and the perspective, I suppose, of many liberal thinkers, this is an amazing event. When I read about it in Time magazine, it didn't bother me. I thought another young theologian wanting to take on one of the giants, and didn't think anything about it. But when I heard today that it was on the front page of the Roman newspaper, then that becomes much more alarming. You see, for years, Rahner has been unassailable in Rome. I mean, no one attacked him since before the beginning of the council. It was almost like, well, if Rahner said it, then it's all right. Then it's orthodox. It's in line with things. Now, some people in Rome are feeling powerful enough, and I don't know what else they're feeling, and to attack him on the front pages of the paper. Well, that's really quite amazing. I mean, I don't know what all that will mean yet. But out of all the stuff that's been going on, I haven't thought much about it till I got that long-distance call today at noon saying that this had occurred. And that's the first time that I've really taken with much seriousness the attacks that are coming out of Rome upon many the liberal type approaches to Christian living. So in that, right before Rahner's first anniversary of his death. So I guess the phrase was used that Rahner was a theological acrobat, which was indicating, I suppose, that he could manipulate and twist and turn things the way he wanted. So I can't say more than that. I will have a copy of this, I think, within a week or so, and be able to make more judgments about it. Anyway, so with that rather long preliminary section, I'll get into the topic for tonight. And that is that we're talking about tonight about our spiritual quest in terms of justice, the search for justice in our lives and in our world. And the rest of the title says the church is an instrument of the kingdom. So we're trying to talk tonight about searching for justice, but doing it as ecclesial Christians, as people who are members of a church. Now, I mean, it's always hard, I think, to get into these kind of topics because they're heavy and they aren't as personally involving as many other questions. I always feel like I got to work a lot. That's why I have this microphone here. I always feel like I got to work harder on these kind of topics, and so I thought I better save my energy. But I want to start out by dealing with the question of people who say that the church has nothing to do with the questions of justice, nothing directly to do with those. That is, that many people talk about a merely privatized Christianity, where religion amounts to something that goes on in the church, it's confined to the sacristy, as it was said. It is emphasis on the vertical dimension, me and God. And that the great phrase in all of that is that religion is about saving our souls. That is, that we are to get ourselves to heaven. That is what life is all about. That's what Christianity is all about. It is a very private kind of understanding of Christianity. It's come out in our own time, and people who are upset, I suppose, with the bishop's entry into the questions of peace and economics, so that the rallying phrase for many people became, well, the bishop should attend more to the cathedral and less to the Pentagon. That's a way of symbolizing this question of keeping Christianity in sort of a private state. And there's a whole lot of that kind of thinking that goes on. A second way, maybe, of getting at the problem is what under the heading of false consciousness. So there's a lot of people who don't have any big, I mean, they're not going to rally around that phrase, keep the priests in the sacristy or anything, but they simply are unaware of the fact that religion has an impact on the world. They're unaware of the fact that the church is a powerful institution that influences society. They just simply have not come to a perception of the fact that the way Christian people live and conduct themselves has a bearing on questions of justice. They just don't think in those terms. They're blinded to all of that. I mean, they're not terribly against it, and if it's pointed out to them, very often their consciousness will be raised. In other words, if you begin to say, hey, we got all these Catholics around the world, and if we all united in some way to try to help feed hungry people, we probably could make a difference. And they say, oh, geez, I never thought of that. Yeah, why don't we do that? So but we have a whole bunch of people who are simply suffering from false consciousness. They don't notice what we often call social sin. They don't see that institutions very often hurt people. A third way that I would try to get at this problem of the people who are just not involved or want to privatize Christianity is the sense that when we do reach out to others, that we do it in terms of personal charity, and that sort of ends it all. It's the idea of giving a food basket to people who are poor on Christmas. Certainly a laudable kind of thing to do. And many people, however, feel that that's sort of the end of what charity is all about. It's, of course, the kind of criticism that some people mount of Mother Teresa, if it's possible to criticize such a saintly woman, but some people will say that she doesn't have enough sense of institutional questions, that she's big on privately helping people, and she takes those people off the streets of Calcutta and helps them to die in dignity. But they want to say, well, why doesn't she do something, though, to move the Indian government to adopt policies so that there wouldn't be those million people out on the streets in Calcutta? So one of the things, when we're looking at all this, is that many Christian people have a very private notion of charity. They think that they were always ready to give a few bucks to someone who's down and out, to help other people, but there's no perception of the fact of working through institutions, changing laws, trying to create better situations for people. Now maybe I just try to go in one step further with that and say that among some of the Christian people today, there's a very limited way in which they want to say the church could be involved. They want to say the church, all right, with justice questions, yeah, but, and Michael Novak would in many ways represent this, that they think that the way that the church can help is primarily through moral persuasion. That is, if on the economics question, what Novak said was one of the great things that the church could do is to get men to be more responsible in bringing up the children that they've brought into the world. But that's the big contribution of the church, and that's the right stance for the church. That's then you're preaching the gospel. You're telling these young men you have to be responsible, and that's the way the church really would help with the economic problems, the hunger problems, and so on in our country. Then put in a negative way, they would say the church should not be very actively involved in the social, political, economic order. Not directly so, but only by influencing the hearts of individual people who would then go out and try in one way or another to help the brothers and sisters who are less fortunate. Okay, so the first point I'm making is that when we start talking about justice, there's a whole group of people who are sort of uninvolved, although they're believers, they're uninvolved in the quest for justice in an institutional way. For some, they just think that's wrong. You're not supposed to be. That's not what the Christianity's all about. You just get yourself to heaven and get your family to heaven, and that's it. Other people simply are insensitive, unaware of what is going on, unaware of the possibilities of impacting the society. Still others talk only in terms of private charity and not dealing with the legalities of the situation. And finally, the group that I was mentioning, often called the neoconservatives, who want the church to work not on institutional matters but through moral persuasion. Now there's a second way in which the problem comes up in the search for justice. Now I'm thinking of people who are involved and who are in the peace movement, who are trying to lobby Congress to do something about hunger, who are generally concerned. Their consciousness has been raised. They often hurt over the pain of the world. They're very aware of the hunger in Ethiopia right now. They're very concerned about nuclear weaponry and what we're going to do about that. Yet, they have particular set of problems, other problems. The first one is that people in that state often feel overwhelmed. We end up with a phenomenon known as burnout. So that people are in there struggling away, trying to do what they can do, and it just seems too big. I mean, how are we ever going to feed all those people in Africa? And even if we can feed them for the next 3 months, What do we do after that? What do we do next year when they say the problem's even going to be worse? It's just overwhelming to us. What are we going to do about the peace question? Geez, I've written my congresspersons, I've been in the marches, I've done all of that, and the vote comes out in the Senate today in favor of building the MX, to release the funding. So, what happens with all that? You feel defeated by that. All this talk of peace and all the coalition sane and clergy, laity concerned, and all these various groupings. You send them their money, you write your letters, you do all of that stuff, and we can't win a vote on the MX in Congress now, because the president's able to twist the arms and apply the pressure, and because we've got the peace talks starting now and so on. So people say, it gets down to people saying, well, what's the use? I mean, why do I bother? I feel lost. It's just too big a problem. And we get many people dropping out. People burned out and saying, hey, I did my bit. I served my 3 years. That's it. Enough for me. Very common phenomenon. People just lose energy, lose the will, say, I can't sustain the effort. Now, a second kind of problem with people who are involved, I will talk about on the head of a utopianism. That is, there's a certain number of people who enter the movements, their consciousness gets raised, they say, geez, this just isn't right that women are denied their rights in the society, they don't make as much money for comparable work as men, they're second-class citizens in the church. I'm going to get this straightened out. We got these listening sessions. I'm going to go give my piece there, and so they go and do it. They get involved and say, now we're going to get this straightened out. We're going to get justice for women in the world and church. And well, it doesn't happen in 2 months, 6 months, and before long people are saying, well, no use. Well, it's a utopianism, a sense that we're going to create a world with no injustice in it, that we're going to quickly get it all straightened out. Maybe there is the sense that that we could create structures that would be totally fair, and everyone would be equal somehow, have equal opportunities. I just read an article recently about John Newhouse, some of you might have, a Lutheran pastor, it was Richard Newhouse. And saying that one of his problems with the utopian type people is that where they draw the line between good and evil. He says, that the problem is that people like that are always drawing that line between us on our good side and then the line and all those other bad people over there, in the sense that we are the oppressed and there are the oppressors over there. And if we could just get us in control here, the oppressed, then we would have a good situation. Then we would have a utopian kind of world. And Newhouse makes the point that perhaps that you ought to draw that line between good and evil someplace else. And he suggests that we draw it through our own hearts, and that we recognize the ambivalence in our own hearts, and that no matter what group ended up in charge, or however we structured the world, or the church, or the parish, or the whatever other communities we're in, that there would always be the sinful heart that we would have to contend with, and that would end up somehow issuing in sinful institutions. So the second point I was making is for those very involved who have high idealism, very often that high idealism seems to move in the direction of a utopianism that thinks we get quick results, or there are simple solutions, or there's some way to structure the world so that there'll be no outs, no marginalized, no outcasts, no poor, no people suffering injustice. Well, those would be some of the ways I would try to get at the problem. So this whole thing's supposed to be our spirituality. We're trying to figure out how we can be more effective Christians. And whenever we start to look at that, we're supposed to look at, well, where are we deficient? Where don't we measure up? Where are our blind spots? Where are our weaknesses? So what I've tried to do is give a catalog of problems there, and maybe what is needed at that point is sort of to reflect on it and say, well, where is me in that? You know, where do I fit in those various groupings or categories as I try to look at quest for social justice? I'm going to suggest we take a minute of silence now, and each one of us tries to locate ourselves, see that where we are in this quest for justice. All right, why don't we just see if there's any comments anyone wants to make at this point? Questions, comments, fill-ins, identifications, or maybe there's other ways people experience this quest for justice. We could sort of add to our listening here. Do we need some clarifications or? Okay, well, we'll go on and see when the questions might arise. So as always, now I want to look to Karl Rahner for some guidance in all of this. And I think I might start out just with some sort of biographical notes on Rahner. His best student that he ever had, most important student, is a fellow by the name of Johannes Metz. And Metz, who of course became an important theologian in his own right and was a great friend of Rahner's, was also a great critic of Rahner's in this area that we're talking about here. And that is that Metz said that Rahner did not have a deep enough, extensive enough understanding of institutional problems. That he didn't understand the quest for justice enough in terms of systems. Example, when they try to look at this is pretty common among the German theologians, when they look at what went wrong in the Second World War and the rise of Hitler and so on, Rahner's general response to that is that, well, small groups of Christians should have banded together and tried to oppose Hitler. That's what was needed. When Metz looks at that same question, he says, no, the real leverage was in the hands of the German Catholic bishops and the whole institutional church that they had. And there are indications that Hitler did indeed fear the German bishops, and that they may well have had leverage on that situation. So Metz would say that Rahner's viewpoint is short-sighted, that the way to have stopped Hitler was to mobilize the institutional power of the church for the bishops to speak out against Hitler. Now maybe that's a graphic way of trying to tell you what Metz's very involved theoretical critique of Rahner is. You understand the difference there. In other words, Metz is saying that Rahner doesn't appreciate enough institutions and structures and their power. On the other hand, Rahner always respected his students, and he said at one point that in fact he wrote that in the introduction to my book about himself, that it was the critique of Metz, it was the only critique that Rahner really took seriously out of all of the criticisms he received from other theologians. And my own reading is that as he got older in life, he tried to incorporate that into his own thinking. In fact, as Rahner went along in life, one of the things that became really important to him was the dialogue between Christians and Marxists. And he entered into that dialogue directly. And it was at that time that he developed a lot of his notions about the power of structures. The dialogue of the Marxists, of course, they're saying that the church buttresses unjust structures, and therefore they forced Rahner to think more carefully about this whole question. So, and just to give you a little more feel of the way I think he was very open to his student Johannes Metz and did learn a lot from him, and I think Rahner still has a lot to offer us on this whole question, although many people want to dismiss him and say that we ought to turn elsewhere when we start talking about justice. I don't think that's true. I think he still has a message for us, although I believe we would find help in a lot of other places as well. So, let me look at some of the things Rahner might say. The first thing I want to say is his distinction between the church and the kingdom. Rahner always said that one of the most important things said at the Second Vatican Council is the statement in the Doctrine of the Church that the church is the sign and the instrument of the kingdom. You'll notice I've used that in these last two lectures. So last week it was the church as the sign of the kingdom. And that means that the church is an institution composed of weak and sinful, yet graced individuals like you and me. We gather together, very human, very weak, and so on. And we are not the kingdom together. We're not perfect. We're not a perfect example of peace and justice and shalom and righteousness and so on. We're messed up in a lot of ways. And yet our vocation or our call is to be a sign of the kingdom, to be an example in the world of a group that's struggling for that kind of justice and peace. So we are to be a sign of the kingdom. The kingdom, or the reign of God in the Scriptures, implies perfection, implies the triumph of grace. It implies justice and peace. We used to identify these two. There's a reason why this is important. I think many people in this room grew up thinking, at least through sermons and through religious education classes, that the church was the kingdom. For example, when the parables, the preacher get up and preach about the parable of the kingdom being like the mustard seed and growing and getting bigger, many sermons said, yeah, that's the church. It's small at the beginning, and it's growing, and it's going to keep growing, and our job is to make it grow till it's really large. In other words, that preaching made people think that when Jesus was talking about the reign of God or the kingdom, he was talking about the church. Now, what we've come to see more clearly, and Rahner has been a big help with this, is that that is too simple. The church isn't the kingdom. The church is sinful. The church is a pilgrim group. The church carries heavy baggage. The church, however, is called to be the sign of the kingdom. That's the point I wanted to make last week. In other words, when you look at an average parish, it ought to have enough goodness there so you get a sense, yeah, geez, men and women could treat each other as equal. Yeah, look at people, rich and poor come in the same place, they get along, and they're able to worship together, and it works out fine, young and old, so on. That's the way we would like the church to be a community, which is a sign of the kingdom. Now, tonight we want to say that the church, the other side of that, is to be an instrument of the kingdom. That is a means for establishing the kingdom. It's supposed to be one of the vehicles for moving towards peace and justice in the world. So, Rahner wants to say, first of all, let's distinguish those things out. The church is not the kingdom. Get it straight. When the parable of the mustard seed is talking about the reign of God, it's talking about the triumph of grace in the world and not us Catholics getting more numbers into our church. However, it seems as though part of the import of this whole thing is to say then the church is instrument of the kingdom. That is, as a function. Its job is to help promote the kingdom. Oh, and that's where I would locate, that's part of my first answer here to the people who are saying that Christianity is just privatized, that it's just me getting my soul to heaven. Well, that really can't be, because we are a community as a church, a group of people, and we got a further task of trying to promote peace and justice in this world of ours. Now let me take up a second reason why I think we cannot settle for a privatized Christianity. This is Rahner's really favorite one. And that is the unity of the love of God and the love of neighbor, something that's very scriptural. In other words, we read in the Bible that if we say we love God and hate our neighbor, that we are liars. For St. Paul, it was the love of neighbor that was in the center of the whole business of being Christian. So Rahner says there is an essential and inescapable bonding between those two things. You really can't have one without the other. It's the same biblical idea. How can we love God whom we've never seen if we hate our neighbor who's right here? In other words, there doesn't seem to be any way to actually love God without doing it in the context of this world, without interacting with other people. It just doesn't. What would you do? How would you ever demonstrate it? How would you show it? How would you accomplish it? It seems that the clear way that we're called upon to do it is precisely by loving our neighbor. Rahner says that in the modern world, talk of love of God rings hollow if people do not see us loving our neighbor, that it simply is not a credible witness. It won't make it among those who are not part of our group. They won't look at us as a valid sign apart from the love of neighbor. We could say all day long we're going to church and we're worshiping and saying our prayers and trying to love God in this way, but it will not make an impact on anyone. It seems that in our contemporary world, people want deeds. In the United States, we say actions speak louder than words. That's part of our culture. And so there is this great emphasis, therefore, on the love of neighbor. Rahner says, therefore, that in the contemporary situation, the primacy has to be on the love of neighbor. Start out with that. And then he says that the love of neighbor will always have a secret love of God in it. That if you concentrate on the love of neighbor, you are a better chance of being on the right track. Because eventually it becomes hard to love the neighbor unless you can see the Lord in them, unless you think there's some deeper meaning in it, unless there's some motivation that strikes in the roots of your very being. It's hard to sustain it. That's where Rahner gets his idea of the anonymous Christian. Rahner says everybody who's going around loving their neighbor is really imitating Jesus Christ and is secretly, whether they know it or not, living out the Christian message, and they are loving God. Even someone who denies the existence of God is actually, by concretely doing some act of love of neighbor, is implicitly showing love of God. So you see, from both sides, Rahner says there's an indisputable unity, an essential unity between those two things. And that, therefore, any notion of a private kind of Christianity that would go this way, the vertical dimension, would automatically be wrong. The only way that Christianity works right is this way, with the cross, where the vertical and the horizontal intersect, where our love of God spreads out to love of neighbor, and where the love of neighbor already includes this upward movement, the vertical movement towards God. Okay, that's a second warrant, I would say, or second reason why private Christianity just simply doesn't make sense. Let me try a third way yet. You know what is important about this to me is the precision of it. I suppose that's the very way I'm trying to approach it, because I feel that the problem for many people in the world today who are committed to justice questions is, how do I convince others? How do I spread that? How do I let others know this? And, just to emote about it very often is ineffective. Like, oh, what do you mean you're not into this? What do you mean you're going to just save your soul? I mean, I don't think we can use that, I suppose, but I would think we got to go beyond that. We got to be able to say in clear, precise ways why we think it's true that Christianity has to be concerned with economic justice, with bringing peace into the world, with overcoming racism and sexism and so on. Need precise reasoning. I guess that's what I'm trying to provide here in these points I'm making now. So I'm to a third one, and that is that God's grace operates not just on our own hearts, but is operative through the whole world. That salvation, God wills the salvation of this whole cosmos of ours. What do we say in Romans 8? The whole world, the whole of creation groans until it will share in the victory of the sons and daughters of God. It is a cosmic sense that the creation is good. We speak in our scriptures of a new heaven and a new earth. You see, the previous training very often denied this. So many people in school were taught, well, at the end, it'll all be burned up. That was the end picture that people had. The world, everything's burned up, destroyed, all this stuff we were creating. All this science we were developing and the culture we were building and everything human that really concerned us, that's at the end time, it's burned up. It's gone. It's like the first stage of a rocket that is jettisoned, and then the soul or something streaks on up to God. I just know that's the way many people were taught about the end time. Well, there's things in the scriptures that, would lead one to think that. But there's a counterpoint in the scriptures as well. It's in Romans 8, as I suggested. It's in the book of Revelation when it talks about the new heaven and the new earth. That what God's salvation is all about is bringing a new heaven and a new earth, a new cosmos, creating a world that is now devoid of imperfection, where the evil falls away and the good that's been accomplished and created is kept. A new world where there is indeed peace and justice. So what am I saying? Salvation, in a broad sense of healing, of bringing wholeness, of bringing a final fulfillment, extends beyond my soul. It extends, first of all, to my whole being, my person, all that I am. It extends as well to my loved ones. It extends as well to the whole of our community. And before long, you keep extending that out, and you realize God's plan is for the salvation of all people. That's why the doctrine of the Assumption is so important. It says Mary was taken to heaven, body and soul. And the indication is that she's the first one after Christ to be rewarded like that, and that it is our own fate as well. So I'm trying to broaden out for you the notion of salvation based on the idea that grace is at work in all the world. Grace is at work in structures and systems and institutions as well as individual hearts. You can see that some structures facilitate the human good. In some ways we organize ourselves and we say, geez, most people feel comfortable here. Here, men and women can approach each other as equals. Here we've got a setup that works pretty well. That's grace. That's a grace structure, a grace situation. So the third reason that I'm offering here in this business is to say that salvation and grace are operative throughout our world and not just in my own soul. Understand another one yet here? Another way to keep looking at this. And that is, I've said this often, but it needs to be repeated, I think. That is the notion of social sin. So again, you notice how I'm contrasting this way. Almost most people in the room were trained in a private type of Christianity. All these areas were private. Faith, my belief in God, salvation, getting my soul to heaven. Even going to Mass, we had that sense. You say your rosary or say your private prayers. You can see how there was a tremendous, almost overwhelming private sense of what Christianity was all about. One of the things that Rahner in the Second Vatican Council has done is to put that in a more social, communal dimension. Okay? So sin is another example of this. The word sin, for us, very often was my private failing. my omission, commission, my going against my conscience. And I would be reprobate because of that. I would be subject to condemnation as a result. Private notion of sin. Now, what Rahner and others have developed is what we commonly call a social sense of sin. Just as grace can be not only in parts, but also systems and structures, so can sin. When we start thinking about social sin, the clearest example we have in the United States, it seems to me, is the institution of slavery. So slavery was such a horrible thing. I mean, people who saw Roots began to get some feel of that. I talked to many people who said that after watching Roots, it's the first time they really knew, anything about what that slave experience must have been like. I mean, but it was a demonic system. You realize there were good Christians who quoted their Bible in support of slavery. I've told you this before. The bishops wrote a pastoral letter in 1852 and did not condemn slavery, Catholic bishops in the United States. So this begins to tell us what social sin is. Social sin is when the system degrades people, hurts human beings, keeps them at the margins, doesn't give them power, makes them feel inferior. And there we see it in such a tremendous way, the systematic breakdown of family life, systematic effort to keep them illiterate. And we suffer from that social sin today yet. That's what our affirmative action programs are supposed to be trying to overcome, but we suffer from that as a culture, as a whole. We, the majority group in the culture, we suffer from that. And some people seem unable to appreciate that. They just are blind to that. They don't understand what does that mean to grow up in a family where there's no tradition of literacy, of education. What does it mean to grow up in a family that is only a few generations removed from systematic destruction on purpose of the family life? That's social sin. Well, we can multiply examples of other things, but you notice how social sin then involves false consciousness. That is, if it's the prevailing system in the culture, then you don't even notice it. You just take it for granted. And the clearest example of that, of course, is sexism. Another example of social sin that exists even within the church. So when we say a sinful church, we don't just mean that it's you and me, that we're sinners, but also there is social sin in the church, structural sin. Clearest example, as I said, is sexism. That is, people repeated prayers for years that talked about saving men and never realized that that might be offensive to women who hear it. I mean, you just say it over and over, and then after one points it out to one, you say, well, I wonder why I never thought of that. I wonder why I never thought of it. We celebrate that story of Abraham and Sarah. Nice work, Abraham. He pawned Sarah off as his sister and saved his skin. Terrific. But for years no one ever thought of how Sarah felt about that. Being denied as a wife. So, I mean, it's, the Mary Magdalene thing. People automatically assume, you say Mary Magdalene, and people say prostitute. Whereas, as a matter of fact, there's no real indication in the Scriptures that she was a prostitute at all. In fact, we know that when it says that 7 devils were cast out of her, that was a common saying for the fact that she was seriously ill and was cured. So, all of that is what concretely, what social sin means. That is, sexist approaches are in place, and everybody, even the oppressed group, simply takes it for granted. They just take the reading of the dominant group and accept it as fact. Mary Magdalene is a prostitute, or so on, whatever else we're talking about. So, the reason Christianity cannot just be private, fourth reason, if I'm counting right here, is because there's social sin. And because social sin has to be attacked. And because social sin is in the church as well. And we might as well get out the other great fact of social sin in the Christian churches. Probably leaps to other people's minds as well, and that is anti-Semitism. It's almost built in a way. You know, it's built into the Gospels when it said, may his blood be upon our hands and our children. Well, there is, in other words, right in the Gospels already, you see a certain ideology present. You know, it's in the talk of the Pharisees. Now, you know, you ask almost anybody who's listened to Scriptures for a long time, well, what about Pharisees? Pharisees are bad people, just outright, that's people's reaction. Well, historically, we happen to know that Pharisees weren't bad people. Pharisees were terrific. Pharisees were the lay people. They're very good people. They were very interested in the law. They didn't play ball with the Roman occupiers like the Sadducees did. And yet, because of our ideology on this, it's just assumed Pharisees bad. You're going to see that development right within the Scriptures. At an earlier strain, the Pharisees come up to Jesus and ask him a question. By the time you get to Matthew's Gospel, the Pharisees, with a devious heart, come up and ask Jesus a question. So right when the movement from Mark's Gospel around 70 to Matthew's Gospel around 85, the anti-Semitism, the bias against the Pharisees has grown. So that, you see, the social sin begins to infect the Christian group very early on, and you end up with false consciousness. That's why we got the Second Vatican Council. It was the declaration on the Jewish people. I mean, they had a terrible fight over that. You know, remember that made the news. That was a big thing, you know, of sort of absolving the Jewish people of this guilt over the killing of Jesus. Oh, and a very important advance in the Second Vatican Council because it took away the underpinnings of anti-Semitic outlaws. You know, so they said it's not right to accuse all the Jewish people of the time of Jesus of being against him or killing him. As a matter of fact, we have a tradition that says that, you know, crowds followed him. Nor would it be right to accuse Jewish people today of that. So, trying to show you in many ways how social sin is at work in our world. And if we are going to fight for justice, for peace, for mutuality, for equality and fairness, then we have to see this broader thing. The church and us as individual Christians have to be involved in this horizontal